Good evening. I'm Rocco Sano. I'm a member of the Princeton Club Program Committee, and I'm also the chair of the Empire State Center for the Book. The Center for the Book is the New York State affiliate of the Library of Congress Center for the Book, and we promote books and literature, libraries, and learning. So in my role as the director for the Center for the Book, I get to go to publisher previews where publishers will tell me about their new books. And I was recently at a preview at HarperCollins, and I was introduced to this book called Wild City by Tom Hines. And it is a fascinating book about the history of New York told through 40 animals. And I want to welcome Tom here this evening. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you so much for having me, Rocco. It's so nice to be here. It's really, really an honor to be here. Thank you.
Yes, and you have a Princeton connection.
I do. I have. I married into Princeton. My wife is a class of '08, and both of her sisters are also alumni.
Yes.
It's the closest I've gotten to the Ivy League, and I'm very thrilled to continue this sneaking in. It's great. I'm very happy.
Yeah. Well, you're not sneaking in. We're glad to have you. Yes, and so since reading this book, I have become very popular on the virtual cocktail Zooms because I've learned all this great information I can share with people, and I get a few oohs and ahs about this. And so I recommend the book for a gift for anyone who loves New York City, because they will just love this book. And we will have a link where you can purchase the book. And the link is at the Center for the Book. And it's a bookshop, and it actually sends all the orders to independent book stores closest to wherever the person's living. And so we're helping support independent bookstores. And when you use the Center for the Book link, we also receive some funds. And that, considering we do not get funds anywhere else, every little bit helps. And so thanks. And again, I'm going to say that a few times throughout the evening. I know actually who's here tonight. So I will be watching who is actually buying books. But anyway, this is like an interview. It's sort of like a talk show type thing. But this is not the first time you've done something like this. So we have a video of your very, very first time being interviewed, and I think it's a fun thing.
Welcome back to the show, folks. Our next guest is the author of Wild City, A Brief History of New York and 40 Animals. Won't you please welcome to the show Mr. Thomas Hines.
Hi, thanks so much for having me on the program.
Thanks for coming. Your book is about the wildlife and animals of New York. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
I thought instead I might show you some of these fascinating critters that we feature in the book. How'd you like that?
Sure.
So first, let me introduce you to Apis mellifera, as it's commonly known, the honeybee. These industrious little critters work together in a hive to make honey.
So clearly that's a dog dressed as a bee.
Great question. Nurse bees can actually create a new queen bee anytime they think the hive needs one. And once that new queen bee hatches, she will fight the reigning queen bee to the death.
It's fascinating stuff. What else you got?
Now, tigers are usually found living in Asia, except of course this one that lived undetected in a Harlem apartment for 3 years.
Okay, that's just another dog dressed like a tiger. Is that the same dog?
Hang on. Is there really a tiger living in Harlem for 3 years?
Oh yeah, the NYPD had to get involved. It's all there in the book. Wait until you hear how they saved peregrine falcons from going extinct. Has anyone seen that tiger?
The book is called Wild City. Thomas Hines, thank you so much for being here. Make sure you join us tomorrow night when our guests will be Yoko Ono and Mark Messier. Good night, everybody.
I gather that's your dog who was making.
Yeah, that's Ladybug featured in the dog chapter. Actually, that's the same Ladybug. Yeah, and then my friends Mary Beth Barone, who's an up and coming writer and comedian and just all around star, and her older brother Jamie as the talk show host, rounding out.
Well, you look like were having a lot of fun like that, and I'm kind of disappointed you weren't wearing that outfit tonight.
Yeah.
But tell me, where did the inspiration for Wild City come from?
You know, I get this question a lot, and I saw a friend earlier today, and he said, "Have you always loved animals?" And I said, "Not really, but I've always loved New York City." And I just found, you know, it was a way to write about this place that I love and this history that I love, and a way to kind of sneak in some environmental activism and some environmental, you know, history, I guess. But more granular than that, I had written an article about alligators in the sewers when I was working at a PR agency and just like looking to do more freelance writing. And my parents grew up in Brooklyn, and I thought when they told me that there were alligators in the sewer, I thought they were making that up. And then I heard that other people's parents had told them that. So I sort of wrote an article about where that came from. And a friend of mine, after that came out, said, "You know what you should do next? You should go look at those parrots out in Greenwood Cemetery." And I really had a light bulb moment, like, hey, you know what? This could be a book. And I thought I could get to about 12 or 15 animals. And I got to 40. And I probably, if I wrote the book today, I could probably do 50 or 55. I think there's, you know, one thing kind of led to another, and we just kind of cut it off at 40. But there's a lot of material out there. Surprising, I came to find.
Well, the sequel, More Wild City. Yes.
Yeah.
And so you have 40 stories in your book about various animals, and they're divided into sections.
Yes, that's right.
What are the 5 sections?
So I opened and closed the book with like sort of like an introduction and a look at the natural history of New York and stuff like that. But the sections, the first section starts with the native animals, which seemed like the reasonable place to start. The animals that were here pre-Dutch, so pre-Henry Hudson, pre-European settlement. And from there, we had all these sort of the sewer alligators, as an example, the mandarin duck in Central Park, the collect pond monster, the East River monster. We kind of didn't know what to do with those, so we called them the celebrities, the legends. And then the third section, because New York is such a hardworking town, are worker animals, so dogs and bees and things like that. And then I came to find that the arc of this story, even though they are 40 different stories, is that New York had this ecological richness. We polluted the hell out of the place, to put it mildly. And then we started to make some amends around the late 1960s, early 1970s with the EPA and things like that. And we see that takes us to our 4th section, which is returned animals. These were animals that were originally driven away, that belong here, that were driven away by maritime trade or pollution or what have you, that have since returned. So those are the returned animals. And then finally, I talked about newcomer animals, which I had for shorthand used as immigrant animals, because I found that it really mirrored the experience of a lot of human New Yorkers, especially actually the parrots of Greenwood Cemetery, particularly because people didn't really like the parrots at first, and they were sort of persecuted to a degree, and all they wanted was to live by themselves and raise children, well, not children, but young parrots, and just, you know, survive on their own. They weren't looking to bother anybody. And yeah, it just felt like that was those 5 things really encapsulated, or were a way to encapsulate some of the New York experience, the human New York experience, I should say.
So you're going to give us like a little preview of the book through 5 five of these creatures, one from each of the sections. But I want to tell everyone that's here that if you have questions, to put the questions in the question box, and we will answer them at the end. And I have a few already. So yes, so what's the first creature you're going to be telling us about?
So for this, I thought we could talk about the white-tailed. Oh, so this is the tiger. Excuse me. Yes, this felt obviously appropriate given
Yes.
given the mascot. I've learned a thing or two about Princeton. I heard that your mascot is a tiger, and this was an interesting story. So and I want to just take a quick moment to highlight the great illustrator that I worked with on this project. Her name is Kath Nash. She's based in Brooklyn. She was a total joy to work with, and not to be biased, but as you can see, she's clearly very talented. Kath really was helpful in originating a lot of these illustrations, except this one is actually almost traced from a photograph. This really happened. An NYPD guy came down the side of a building with a tranquilizer gun in his hand, and a Bengal tiger that was maybe 400 or 600 pounds was standing on end, screaming at the top of its lungs or roaring or whatever a tiger does. So the story here is, this is the Drew Hamilton houses, public housing in Harlem. I think it's in the 150s. And there's a guy named Antoine Yates who became the Tiger Man before there was the Tiger King. And Antoine kept that tiger in his apartment for 3 years. And, became sort of this New York Post, this is not my feeling on him, but sort of like this idiot celebrity, like you did this dumb thing. And I'm not defending what he did. I think it is pretty a bad idea to keep a tiger in the housing projects or any apartment in New York City for that matter. But to hear him tell it, he had 2 lions previously. He had an alligator at the same time as the tiger. And, this is a guy that if he had grown up in a better zip code, he may have gone to veterinary school. And this was how he was able to sort of express his love of animals, as misguided as that obviously was. There was a confrontation when he brought a stray cat into his apartment, because again, he thought he was like a vet. He found this injured cat and thought, I can't bring this to someone else. I'm the person that the animal should be brought to, disregarding the fact that he had a tiger in the apartment and an alligator. So the tiger tried to eat the cat. The tiger then bit him. He went to the hospital and said that a pit bull had bit him. But of course, the radius of his bite was much larger than any dog could make. Anyway, that takes us to the next day when Officer Duffy is coming down the side of the building and sees this big cat there in captivity. And I will just say that I actually was able to track this guy down and speak to him on the phone, and he was a really nice guy. And I don't think that he really saw anything wrong with what he was doing and wanted to continue, even now 15, 20 years later, because that was in about 2003, wants to continue working with animals, so maybe he can do it in a better facility than the housing project.
So do we have to read the book to find out what happened to the tiger?
Well, I mean, yes, please. Yes. Buy a copy, and I won't say another word.
No. Tell us what happens to the tiger.
Well, so he got arrested, and the tiger was sent to a rehab center, and actually only died about a year or 2 ago. Not like a
Really?
Wildlife, maybe like a Tiger King thing. Actually,
Right.
I had written this before that came out, but I will just say one funny thing about that is that the day this was happening, I think it was October 3rd, 2003, he's getting attacked by his tiger in his house. And he is able, and I read about this in the book, he had a connection with this tiger, I guess. And the tiger was able to hear the command to relent. And the tiger did relent. And he was bitten, he needed some stitches, but he was able to take himself to the hospital. The same exact day in Las Vegas was the day that Siegfried and Roy were attacked by their tiger, same day. And that tiger did not relent to the, quote unquote tiger expert. And so I say tiger expert because these are wild animals. These are not meant for Harlem apartments, and they're not meant for Vegas stages either. I think that's pretty clear by that day. So
Right. Well, and it's, as you said, it's the mascot of Princeton, but they don't have, I went to Fordham and our mascot was a ram, and we actually had a ram on campus.
Oh, really?
Yes, but I don't think Princeton has a tiger on campus.
Maybe in one of the eating clubs. Maybe. I
Yeah,
don't know.
right.
You'd
You
have to
never
check,
know.
yeah.
Right. And we have questions rolling in, but so on to the next animal.
Yeah. So I forget what we had next. I think it was maybe mosquitoes. So this was an interesting one. This is an animal that I actually added late in the game to the book, and it's very, very instrumental in New York's history, and I think it's kind of relevant now. So what I came to find, which I was very surprised by, was that mosquitoes have killed, by some estimates, half the people that have ever lived. According to this one scholar who just published a book last year, he posits that the mosquitoes swayed the American Revolution and maybe killed Alexander the Great, and have really also shaped and impacted a lot of New York City in early epidemics, which seemed like a historical pursuit when I was writing this 18 months ago, and it feels a lot more relevant now. But the way that plays out in New York City is that we had these epidemics, yellow fever epidemics in, I think, 1798, where 1% of the city's population was killed in a year from yellow fever. And there used to be a neighborhood south of Red Hook, Brooklyn, that was called Yellow Hook, Brooklyn. And they changed the name to Bay Ridge because they didn't want to have the association with yellow fever. And also, according to what I found, that places like the Hamptons and the Jersey Shore, the Hudson Valley, were places that sprung up because people with means had to get out of New York City for the summer because it was dangerous. And so, and now we're kind of doing that again, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I recommend, that is one of my favorite chapters, the mosquito chapter. And I recommend all the chapters, but there's a story about an immigrant quarantine hospital that was built to deal with these yellow fever outbreaks, so that when people came in, they weren't transmitting the diseases. And there's a horrific anti-immigrant demonstration, attack, I don't know what you want to call it, conflagration, where they burned the quarantine hospital after bringing the patients at least outside into the quad or whatever it was. And then they lit this thing on fire, and it could be seen from Manhattan. And that's why Swinburne Island was later made off the coast of Staten Island, which is now home to 100 harbor seals. So all these things, as I was saying, one thing kind of led to another in the book. But the mosquitoes really have had a hand, or whatever you want to call it, in shaping the city's future history, for sure.
And so on to the
white-tailed deer.
The white-tailed deer. Well, where I live in the Hudson Valley, they're all over the place, but I didn't know they were in, well, I actually did know they were in New York because I read the book.
Yeah, and I should mention that the tiger was obviously the legendary representative, and the mosquito was the newcomer representative, and we're going to use this as the native representative. So white-tailed deer are in a few places in New York City, but they're mostly in Staten Island, where it's kind of a problem. And it's an interesting problem because I think it's one of these unintended consequences of wildlife. I think that most people like the idea of whales crashing off the shore and wildlife returning, but it gets to be a little less abstract when we think about the deer, because the deer have come back into these places that we have greened, we have golf courses and parks and all these great gardens, and the deer don't know that they're not supposed to run across the highway. The deer don't know that they're not supposed to breed prodigiously. And that's the other problem, is that nature had intended in this area for cougars and wolves and bears to mitigate the population of deer. But of course, we don't have any of those things around here anymore because we don't want to live near apex predators like that. So most municipalities would have a deer hunt to kind of keep that population in control, that's not really something that we can do even in the relatively suburban Staten Island. That's just not a thing. Beyond ethically or how you feel about it, just logistically, I don't think it's something that New York City Parks Department thinks is possible. So what they've done is this is very kind of innovative mitigation strategy where they're tranquilizing these deer in the middle of the night and with like a dart gun. Sometimes they set up bait. Sometimes the guy just shoots them from the passenger seat of his car, and they do a field vasectomy on the male ones and put a little cattle tag on its ear to indicate that this guy's been taken out of the mating pool. And it's bizarre, and no one else is doing it to this scale. But like, what's to be done?
And it's how much is this is New York City? How much is New York City spending on this birth control?
Birth control. It's in the millions. It was in the millions.
Like,
and of
yeah,
course,
that's what I recall, right?
yeah, it's a front-loaded cost and it's a back-loaded result. So if you're the Staten Island Advance or some snarky blogger, you're like, what are we spending this $300 million on? The number of deer won't go down for 5 or 6 years. You know, it is backloaded, but it's beginning to show some promise. And of course, I'm probably a little more biased to the humane, interesting, innovative method. But you know, if I'm the Staten Island resident, I'm saying, what do we spend all this money on? But what are the other options? So
Yeah. One of the things that I discovered in the book is all these places you can visit, and you're going to have to help me. I want to say the trash heap in Staten Island.
Oh yeah, Fresh Kills. Yeah.
Yes, Fresh Kills, which is now becoming a park. But,
yeah.
And didn't you actually get to tour that on a like a boat?
I've toured it twice, luckily enough. The first time I went with one of the field scientists, she took me around and showed me all the different piping and things like that. And I had an incredible tour of it. And then I think it was the American Architectural Institute runs the boat tours out of Chelsea Pier down the Hudson. And they had one into the creek, into the kind of heart of Fresh Kills. And it's going to be 3 times the size of Central Park when it's done. It's really more akin to a state park or almost a national park. I mean, it's gorgeous, and it doesn't smell, which is really remarkable.
And for all our people that are here tonight, probably I would think that the tours aren't happening right now because of COVID, but it is just say it again. It's the architectural.
Oh, that's that I think is AIA,
AIA. Okay.
America.
So this is anyone can take these tours.
Yeah, and I would check with Fresh Kills too, because they do a lot of interesting stuff, and it's outdoor activity, so there might be a better chance of it happening. But I'm not.
Right. Yeah, and I'm going to jump. I don't think we're going to be talking about our friend the beaver, but
you can if you want, Rocco.
Yeah, but there's another tour that you can take up in, is it the Bronx or?
Oh yeah, and this is definitely worth mentioning. So the beaver, and I'll do a quick abridged.
Yeah, do a quick beaver, because I'm into the beaver part.
Yeah, no, and I am too. So, and I think that the beavers are one of these hidden in plain sight things in New York City. I think, for me anyway, at least in the iconography, we have Beaver Street downtown in the original Dutch downtown. We have not one but 2 beavers on the New York City flag. Astor Place is full of those wonderful beavers, and actually we have an illustration of the Astor Place beavers in the Beaver chapter. But beyond that, if you read Island at the Center of the World by Russell Shorto, he contends that the reason there is New York City is because they're beavers. It's not that just we did it. That's why we were here. And then of course we overdid it, which was sort of our American way in the early 19th century and the 18th century. And the beavers were gone by 1805, 1815. Astor completely divested from beavers because he saw it sort of dwindling, and it just seemed like they would never return. And then of their own accord in 2008, they were spotted on the Bronx River, which itself had been undergoing 30 years of remediation. And the Parks Department, in I think partnership with the Bronx River Alliance, which is another one of these great organizations around the city doing this great work, offers canoe tours on most Saturdays. I'm not sure what their schedule is now, but it was one of the most eye-opening experiences I had in writing this book. I couldn't believe that I was in the Bronx. And it is so much fun. I think it might cost you $15 or $25. That might not even be, it might even be more than it costs. So it is a great value. It is one of the more fun things you can do in New York City.
So you heard it here, I'm not sure at first, but you've heard it here that you can take a canoe trip in the Bronx and you can take, I'm assuming more of a boat trip to Staten Island. Yes.
That's right.
And and the other interesting thing is in the back references, you mentioned one of the things that the Empire State Center for the Book does is we do the New York State Writers Hall of Fame, where each year we induct writers, both living and deceased, into this Hall of Fame. And two of our writers are on your list.
Oh,
and
which ones?
one of them, Russell Shorto.
Of course.
Yeah. And the other one was Robert Caro.
Oh,
so,
well, I mean,
So when I saw that, I go, look at that. We collide here. Yes.
I'll say one thing about Caro, and maybe this is more about Robert Moses. If you want to know the impact Robert Moses had on New York City, this is a book about animals, and he's mentioned 6 times. So, I mean, he can't get away from that guy. You really can't.
Kind of on the negative part.
Well,
Yes. So the next category.
Sure. So let's see what we have next. Also, Robert Caro, Princeton University. So this is one of my favorites. This is the peregrine falcon. This is a returned animal. So this not only returned to New York City, this was one of the greatest conservation stories anywhere. So the peregrine falcon, of course, is the fastest animal on Earth. They can fly 200 miles an hour. They don't really make nests. They live on, they make scrapes on cliffs. So the New Jersey Palisades is a big pre-European habitat for them. But I bring that up because skyscrapers actually can double very well as a scrape for peregrine falcons. So they're very well suited to Midtown. And in the 1950s, when we had this silent spring, DDT and all of our pesticides and working its way up through the food chain, we noticed the I wasn't alive, but they noticed the peregrine falcons were declining pretty rapidly. So this organization based in upstate New York at the time, they're now in Boise, called the Peregrine Fund, basically started this very successful captive breeding program. And it's very, absurd captive breeding program, including these like specially designed hats that the falcons perch on top of and have sex with. And that's after they tried 2 or 3 other equally absurd artificial insemination methods. And that was one of the more fun ones to write. Because it's and they have like this very dry scientific manual where they like work out how you should train your falcon and have sex with the hat that you're wearing. I mean, it's just completely off the wall stuff, but that's the juvenile side of me talking. But the upshot of this is that this nearly extinct animal is no longer even endangered. They are not only in New York City, there are more in New York City per square mile than anywhere else in the world. And that's largely in part to the skyscrapers we talked about in the ledges. It's also pigeons. There's stuff for them to eat all day long. And the illustration that we looked at, there's also a group of New Yorkers now who climb up to the top of the Throgs Neck Bridge and band the baby peregrine falcons in the nest while the mother is swooping around, and which is also just incredible conservation work in its own right. But that image, we see a peregrine falcon flying from the MetLife building to the Chrysler building, and apparently that happens every single morning. And that was one of my favorite illustrations. And I love them all, but that was an opportunity with the illustration where we could capture a scene that we probably couldn't capture with a camera. I could tell you about it, and I'm happy to, you know, but we were able to frame the scene just the right way, and the illustrations that Kath did really opened that up for us.
So, but you mentioned pigeons. Now, I grew up. I think I told you earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in Brooklyn, and one of my childhood memories is atop of all these, you know, like 4-story buildings. You know, people would have pigeon coops.
Sure.
And with homing pigeons.
Yeah.
And all very well trained.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've learned in this book, and I joke, if you only take one thing away from this book, it's that you're probably underestimating pigeons. They're very smart animals. They're incredible athletes. They have this homing ability. Nobody really knows how that works, but they know that it works, and it's worked since, you know, the pharaohs of Egypt used pigeons in this way. There's a pigeon that's stuffed at the Smithsonian Institute named Cher-Ami that is credited with saving 200 American soldiers' lives in World War I. You know, they do well on intelligence. They're in the, you know, they up there with crows and parrots. They're really very, very smart.
Right. And now, did you in your research, are there people that still have pigeon coops?
There definitely are.
Now?
No, there definitely are. And the pigeon research actually was one of these situations where I could have gone in like 20 directions. There's a lot of ways you can go to talk about pigeons. Where I decided to drill down on was a place called the Wild Bird Fund, which is on the Upper West Side on maybe Amsterdam Ave. It's next to the Milk Bar up there, if you like Momofuku. But it's called the Wild Bird Fund, and I like to call it the Hospital for Pigeons. And it's a wildlife rehabilitation center. It's the only one in New York City, and on average, they take in about 9 injured pigeons a day, and other wild animals. They also take in squirrels and turtles, but it's mostly birds. And it's this really nice side of New York. You know, I think New York gets this reputation of being this mean town, and yet we have this nearly a dozen times a day, someone's bringing, you know, an injured rat with wings up to the Upper West Side to get care. And then there's people there who are taking care of them. And that was the direction I went in for that. But in doing some cursory research, there are definitely a lot of pigeon races still happening. There are a lot of pigeon coops that's still happening. There's an artist who named Duke Riley, who actually tied little LED bands on pigeons' legs and did an exhibit, or I don't know, like a performance at the Brooklyn Navy Yard back in 2016. And he had all these pigeons flying at dusk with little glowing bands. It was unbelievable. So there is a lot of people doing a lot of things with pigeons in New York City for sure. And they are helping sustain a very healthy population of raptors. So, you know, with the falcons and the hawks.
Just tell us a little bit about your research. How did you go about? Did you just like Google pigeons in New York, or?
I probably did some of that. Yeah, and I think, well, at one point towards the end, I went through the New York Times archives, and I went back as far as they could go, and I just typed in every animal and saw what's been written about every animal. And there was some good stuff in there, but there was a combination of things. You know, I tried to interview a person, an expert, for every chapter where I could. There's usually a pretty good number of books written about a lot of the animals, not all, about a lot of them. I tried to do some in the field research. With pigeons, I think I was able to do kind of all three. And then also I went to a lot of, you know, speaking events and lectures. The Brooklyn Historical Society, which is right near where I live, is up there in Brooklyn Heights. I went there a lot, and that ended up just being serendipitously this great resource, because they just kept putting on these series of people that I really wanted to hear talk, and I met a lot of sources that way. And then again, one thing just kind of led to the other. Someone says, "Oh, have you talked to this person? You got to talk to this person next." And you just sort of ring them up and say, "Hey, I'd love to talk to you about this book." Yeah, it was a combination of things for sure.
And what's the next animal?
Let's see here. Well, so this animal could go in a few chapters. This could go as a native or returned. I put this animal in as a working animal, as a service animal, because I think what's so interesting about the oyster is how helpful they are to New York City. And of course, there is a very rich history of oysters in New York City. For anyone who hasn't read it, I would very much recommend The Big Oyster by Mark Kurlansky, which is this great story of New York's sort of natural history as told through the oyster. His book sort of ends not on a negative note, but sort of on a realistic note. And what I was happy to add to that narrative of ending on a little bit more of a hopeful trajectory is the work being done by the Billion Oyster Project. And they get their name because they're actually trying to repopulate New York Harbor with 1 billion oysters. And the reason they have that name and that number in mind is a little back of the envelope math. When we look at one oyster's ability to clean something like 50 gallons of water a day, one oyster, it's almost unbelievable that it can do that. That 1 billion oysters could clean all the water in New York Harbor every 3 days. It won't only do that, it'll also attract crabs and fish and other, it really is sort of the building blocks for the marine ecosystem. But it not only does that, it also attenuates storm surges. So if, by some estimates, if the oyster beds had been in place as they were pre-European, that something like Hurricane Superstorm Sandy may have had a reduced impact. So my take on the oyster, it is a return species, it is a native species, but it's what it's doing for New York and what it can do for New York, I think is really rather incredible. And it also gives you this opportunity to really kind of tell that whole trajectory of like, well, we had all this great natural wealth, we squandered it, but we're sort of able to make these amends. And the work being done by the Billion Oyster Project, I think when I wrote the book, they had repopulated 30 million oysters, which is 3%, but they are rapidly increasing that number. I think they're up to 60 or 70 at this point, and they're moving. They have a new operation in Red Hook, and they're doing incredible work.
Well, funny you should mention the Million Oyster Project, because on September 10th, right here, we will be having a program on the Billion Oyster Project. So if you are interested, sign up. It's going to be similar to this, and we can let them know that we talked about them today. Yes.
And I'll just say one last thing about them. They collect thousands of tons of discarded oyster shells from restaurants all over New York City that they then can make into new oysters. I know that's not really the technical term, but yes, that's what they do with them. And the amount of waste that diverts from landfill is its own, great gift to New York City. So they're a great organization.
And unfortunately, because of COVID, originally the Billion Oyster Project event was going to be paired with oysters.
I'm sure, yeah.
But unfortunately, we could not do that. We'll have to wait till the club is open and enjoy all those oysters. Yeah, and did you mention about building the seawall with the oyster shells?
Yeah, so that's a plan that I think is Scape Studios had proposed to the town, to Tottenville, which is sort of the southern end of Staten Island. Really got hammered by, like a lot of places did, by Superstorm Sandy. And one of the proposals is to build a breakwall of oysters. And one of the, I think the motto of Tottenville is the town built by oysters, and now they're the town building oysters. So it's a nice sort of return that this native species can kind of do its own thing left alone. And I think that's a big lesson of environmental remediation, ecology, what have you, is that a lot of times we just really actually need to leave it alone, and these processes can kind of figure themselves out, and it really we just need to stop sort of polluting and messing with things, but they don't really need a lot of help. You know, they just need a little space to do their thing.
Right. Did we cover all 5, or was there one more?
I think that could be all 5.
Was there any other slides? No. No. So now we have a few questions, but I have a few questions myself. So I'm going to start because I'm in the seat here. I get to talk about some of the interesting things. And every, story or section, not section, every animal, creature starts with the collective nouns.
Yeah.
And I just found that fascinating.
Oh,
Collective nouns. And, and so can you just share with us some of the collective nouns?
absolutely. This was one of my, this is an idea I had. And I think that I just, for years, have always loved collective nouns. They're this like totally unnecessary flourish of language. You know, you can just say a bunch of deer. You don't have to say a herd of deer. But the ones that I love the most, I think, are probably a pandemonium of parrots, an embarrassment of pandas. Let's see, with a scourge of mosquitoes. We coined the collective noun for bed bugs, which does not have a collective noun, but that we would call the insomnia of bed bugs. I tried to coin the term for shipworms, which are these little microscopic worms that eat the pillars, the timber piles around New York City. We wanted to call that an instability of shipworms, but apparently that didn't make it through. But the other one I love, I think, is the tiger one, is an ambush of tigers. And then and animals that aren't in here have a lot of fun, like a parliament of owls. And a murmuration of starlings, which is in here. That's another fun one. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's if you're into trivia, you have all the collective nouns here in the book. But we have several questions, and one of them is one that's similar to my question is, what was the most hilarious or unexpected animal story you learned about?
It would probably be the peregrine falcons, just because, and I ended up writing a separate article about the captive breeding program and all of the juvenile details in the dry scientific manual. The story behind discovering that, though, is that I'm on the phone with the peregrine falcon expert of New York City, and he's telling me everything, and I'm recording the conversation. And it was only when I went back and listened to the phone call, and I was typing out my notes, that I realized that he had said, oh, and I guess every once in a while, or not every once in a while, I guess, you know, when they were saving the animals, they taught the animals to have sex with the hats. Anyway, and he just moved on. And it was the most, I was like, wait a minute, did he just, and then when I was listening to the phone call later, I said, did he just say what I think he said? And then I went down this wormhole, and there was this great publication called the AWL, that is no longer publishing. I don't want to take blame or credit for that, but one of the last things that they published was this article about the insane way that peregrine falcons were saved from extinction. So that was a lot of fun. And I think just, you know, this isn't like funny or silly, but one of the things I was so amazed to learn is the return of humpback whales, and how reliably one can go see a humpback whale in New York Harbor. It is, not to pun it, it is no fluke. It is like a real
fluke.
Yeah. Listen, I got animal puns for days. But yeah, no, the humpback whales was, to me, just, I was so happy as someone who's lived in the area and whose family's from New York City, thinking that was never a thing to see. That was like a Pacific Northwest thing. That was a, you know, the Arctic Sea kind of thing. Like, no, that's the Verrazano Bridge. That's the Rockaways. That's here. That was my favorite thing that I learned, I think.
So, editors, they cracked the whip. So, was there an animal story that did not make it in?
I don't think so. Oh, not at all. There was one when I first sent the proposal that and I worked with such a brilliant editor at HarperCollins. Her name is Christina Garces. It still is named Christina Garces, but she was just such a joy to work with, and she's such a pro. When I had sent her the proposal, I said, all right, here are the 40 animals. We kind of had this like last minute thing, like, can we get the number from 24 to 40? And in one night I said, here are the other 16 animals. And I had this idea that we would say in the beginning of the book that one of the chapters was fake. It was totally made up, but I was going to write it as though it weren't. And then at the end of the book, I would reveal which one was fake. And she just missed that in the proposal. And I had this whole like fake story about a walrus at the Navy Yard that the Navy had used as a mascot. I just full fantasy. And we're getting down to like the end, and I was like, all right, I either have to give her this walrus chapter, which I don't think she really remembered I suggested, or I got to write a chapter on horses. And I went to her and I said, hey, I just want to follow up. Like, are we going to do that like fake walrus thing? And she's like, I have no idea what you're talking about, and there's no way we're doing that, which was the right call. But there have been some animals that I've discovered since that I definitely would have included. And the main one is the American bison, which is actually my favorite animal, was saved from extinction in large part because of the Bronx Zoo. And these animals went by train through Grand Central in the early mornings of November 1913 on their way back out west, and this is just like a really great conservation story. And I don't think many people know New York City's role in that.
Yeah, no, I was part of another presentation that you gave, and there's a great children's book.
Oh yeah.
About how the Bronx Zoo saved, the American buffalo or the bison, right?
Yeah.
And so if you have children in your life,
How the Bronx saved bison.
To share with them. And this is a great book also for kids too, because there's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I didn't intend it and I'm very happy that kids like it, because I think kids are an honest demographic. But I've been very delighted by friends of mine sending me pictures of their kids saying, they can't put it down, they love it. And I think one of the things about wildlife is that interactions with wildlife as a child often translate to activism as an adult. So people, and I think we are sort of staring down an environmental crisis in one form or another. And I think that to solve that, we really need to get kids excited about the environment now, because they're going to grow up and vote, donate, and work towards these goals. And I just think that's, if I can indoctrinate the children with this, that'd be my crowning achievement.
Yes. So we have a question about ferrets. Do you think ferrets will ever be legalized in New York City?
I don't know. So that's funny. They're a maligned animal. I'm not a fan of the animal, but I know they are maligned, and I'm not a fan of them. But there is some funny rules about what's legal and what's not legal in New York City. Up until 2009, 2010, beekeeping was illegal. And I went through all of these lists of forbidden animals to keep as pets in researching the honeybee chapter, because the honeybee chapter, it's like, look, bees are great. Like, you have them up on your roof. They're good for the local community. You got this honey. It's like this centuries old practice. Like what? But legally speaking, pre 2009, it was the same category to have, because they listed all the animals that you couldn't have. The honeybees were in the same list as polar bears, which I thought was so ridiculous. It was like, well, clearly there should be some distinction here between the honeybee and the polar bear, but legally there was not. And that got overturned. And now beekeeping is obviously thriving in New York City. And I think New York City is probably better for it. But I don't know much about where things stand legally with the ferrets. I would, of course, support any legislation, even though I don't personally like the ferret. I would, of course, support them.
We also know, you said you don't, well, I know from reading the book and, well, not from reading the book, but something that you mentioned that is it geese or duck?
Yeah, yeah.
Ducks.
So
You're not a fan of them, right?
no, I don't like geese. I think I was bit by a goose as a young kid, but the geese are a maligned animal, and I don't really feel any differently after writing about geese than I did going into it. But what I found was so funny about geese is that, someone's talking about the ferret. I'm sure there is a ferret organization advocacy in New York, because there is an advocacy group for every animal, including geese. Awful, terrible, mean geese have human New Yorkers out there advocating for them. So if the geese have someone looking out for them, then every animal's got to have someone in New York looking out for them. And I think that's like a funny thing I learned about New Yorkers, is that they have these weird soft spots that I didn't really think they would, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think you answered this question about the one animal story that you didn't get to explore. Is the bison, or was
yeah,
there?
there's more. I mean, I was reading this book by Jill Lepore, and it wasn't about animals, but it was about New York City history, a specific moment in time, a slave revolt in like the 1740s, I think. It was called New York is Burning. And there was one sentence in the book about a panther that was walking down Broadway, and then they had to rid Manhattan of panthers. And I thought, geez, that's really interesting. And I just, maybe I didn't look hard enough, and then I just moved on to something else. But that was something I thought, gosh, I would love to know more about that. And I kind of wanted to write an ode to seagulls, which are also terrible, mean animals. But I kind of respect that about seagulls. They're kind of these hardy, mean, just but they can make it anywhere. We were talking about fresh kills earlier, and when I'm going in there as this wildlife writer, they say, well, geez, there was no wildlife here before, and then they catch themselves and they go, oh, well, there were seagulls, so it was and I kind of respect an animal that can survive at the dump, with the worst of what we have, that they're making a go of it. I think there's something somewhat admirable about seagulls, but they didn't make the cut, unfortunately.
I know the answer to this question, but did you include rats?
I did. You can't, would you read a book about New York City wildlife that didn't include rats and pigeons and cockroaches? I just don't know that you can get away with that without including rats. That was my position anyway.
And bed bugs.
Yeah. And bed bugs. Yeah. You got it. So, and that's one thing I think that I touch on in this, is that there are a lot of nasty wildlife that are not here they're not, for every whale crashing off the Rockaways, there's a bed bug in your neighbor's apartment, so and rats are really an interesting animal, and it's an interesting dynamic here in New York City. And I think we're learning more about this as COVID has kind of put things on hold, because the rats have been very impacted by that. But from a rat's perspective, they go out every night and we've left all this food for them. So, if you were to tell a rat, hey, we're trying to get rid of you, I think they would probably be very surprised. You couldn't have that conversation, but I think that a rat would be very, surprised to learn that humans really detest them, given all the food we leave for them. And then, I think there's probably better waste management techniques. Composting, I think, can help actually reduce rats. I really do. I think there are street usage, I think parking restrictions can help. Not even parking restrictions, but if we just use that space, maybe one parking space every block for sealing the trash, you'll have fewer rats. That's, I think, that's the choice. But people need to park the cars, I guess.
Here's an interesting question. What part of New York City did you not know about that you ended up exploring or learning about as a result of writing the book?
I think probably most of them. I think that when I was writing this book, when I started writing this book, I was living, and I still live, in the same zip code, but I was living in Brooklyn Heights. I was working in Midtown, and you just kind of do that circuit, right? And I think a lot of people are where they live and they go. And so I could tell you that I really came to learn about Staten Island. I never really knew I don't think I had ever been to Staten Island before, and really came to love Staten Island. And then just these places in outer Queens, like Forest Park, Van Cortlandt Park up in the Bronx River. It would be easier to tell you about the places that I knew about beforehand, and I have a map in the early pages of the book, this right here, that kind of highlights all these places. And it was a real joy of this book, was being able to go out to the Rockaways, was able to go to Jamaica Bay, go to Staten Island, Van Cortlandt, Bronx River, Inwood Park, all these places, and really kind of, it's a day in the park, literally. That's your work for the day, is a day in the park. So I think that, it would be easier to tell you about the places that I did know about. So.
If you had a favorite animal, what was your favorite animal before writing this book? And did it change after writing the book?
I think probably I gained a lot of respect for raccoons. Raccoons came up in my ranking. I'd known of raccoons my whole life. We had raccoons where I grew up, and I just came to see them as like, gosh, you take a second look at a raccoon, you think these are really smart animals. They like use their thumbs. They can do all these clever things, and they're so ubiquitous because they're kind of clever. And I came to really respect them. But I think probably going in and coming out, the humpback whale was probably my favorite. I felt like that was the real, huge, massive vindication for all of this environmental cleanup that's happened. And they wouldn't be here, for our sake. They're here because the waters are cleaner, and it's a really good sign, and a good reason to keep those environmental efforts going forward. So yeah, I think humpback whales from start to finish have been just my favorite.
And we have more questions here. Are there any foxes in New York? In Manhattan? Yes. No, in Manhattan.
Manhattan, I don't know, but listen, there are coyotes, and there are not only coyotes that sort of come in and visit, as they say, but there's a coyote that lives in Central Park now, and that's a rather recent development. I know there are foxes at Fresh Kills, and I would imagine that out in like Forest Park and in Outer Borough, maybe Prospect Park, there's probably a fox or two, but there's definitely a lot of foxes at Fresh Kills. And I would imagine, the Bronx being the only part of New York City connected to America, there's definitely foxes up there too. So.
Right. The question is, do you remember Pizza Rat?
I do remember Pizza Rat, and we have an illustration of Pizza Rat in the Rat chapter. So not only do I remember Pizza Rat, but we have immortalized Pizza Rat here on page 126. Pizza Rat's an interesting story because it was this viral sensation, digitally viral. I suppose what we're doing now, but it was this rat that was dragging a fully intact slice of pepperoni pizza down a flight of subway stairs. And there was some suggestion that I had discovered that I kind of maybe agree with, that it was a staged event, that someone had trained a rat to bring this fully intact slice of pizza, it's iconic New York City food, down into the iconic New York City. So you have a Subway slice of pizza and a rat. It's a very New York City moment. And my takeaway on that is, if we are to believe that that was a staged event and someone has taken credit for it, so if we are to believe that person who took credit for it, it's still pretty remarkable that a rat could be trained to do that. And so the rat loses no points. Actually, we were talking about the rise in rankings. Pigeons came up in rankings, and rats came up in rankings in my mind. Roaches are still terrible, maybe worse than I thought. Bed bugs are worse than I thought, but rats, and Pizza Rat especially, I think deserved its moment of fame.
Well, I know you worked with the Audubon Society, but I'm not sure if you'll know the answer to this question. Do you know how many kinds of birds spend a lot of time in New York City each year?
Oh gosh, I don't off the top of my head. I mean, I'm thinking like 500. I mean, at a minimum, because what you're dealing with in New York City is a number of things, and this is another, I hope, a takeaway of the book is that New York City is one of the best places in the world to see birds, and it's obviously, and like a lot of the things in the book, that's rather counterintuitive. But we sit on the middle of the Atlantic Flyway, which is one of 4 migratory superhighways for birds across North America, and we are right in the middle of the Atlantic one, the eastern one, and so we have, I mean, more than dozens and dozens of these rare species, these beautiful little scarlet tanagers and indigo buntings and just these super lovely rare birds that come through twice a year. And I think we're actually in fall migration now, even though it's just September 1, where they come back around now. But then we also have all these habitats for year-round animals. We have all of these, we have wooded places, we have shoreline, we have marshes, we have this, so we have skyscrapers that work for falcons, and then we also have a load of introduced birds like pigeons and starlings and parrots. So I'm sure there are some figures on that, and I'm a huge fan of the Audubon Society, and I think that birding in New York City is not only it's a world-class place to bird. It really is, and once you get into it, it's I find it pretty enjoyable. It's a lot of fun. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Have there ever been any bald eagle sightings?
Yeah, I saw one this year, I think, or at the end of, maybe in the fall of last year. Yes. So bald eagles, and this is anecdotally, I've been sort of paying attention to what animals are around pretty closely for the last 5 or 6 years, and thinking about this book, writing this book, researching this book. And, I knew there were falcons and hawks. You'd hear about osprey. And, not to say there weren't bald eagles in the last 5 or 10 years, but in the last year or two, I'm at least from what I'm seeing a lot more mentions of them. And then I saw one at Riverside Park. And there were like 20 other people there, because everybody got the same message on Twitter that the bald eagle was sitting on the tree above, right next to Columbia. The day I was there, it was sort of a standoff between a red-tailed hawk and a bald eagle, and they're looking at each other, and the bald eagle flew away, and it's a lot bigger than a red-tailed hawk or a peregrine falcon. I mean, we're talking like a different magnitude of bird. It is a majestic, humongous bird, and I had never seen one before, and I saw one on the Upper West Side. So, and definitely within the last 6 or 7 months.
Right, and our last question right here is, will the false walrus story ever be released? And it's a great, well, you tell me.
Yeah, I mean,
I'll tell you what I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it should, sure. Yeah, I mean, I had a name for it was going to be Wally the Walrus of Wallabout Bay. I mean, just kind of like,
It's a great children's book. You got it. Get your, I don't know if you have a name.
I don't know if it's like,
just do the big proposal right there. And you can, I don't know what you're working on next, but
I guess that, yeah.
Yeah, you got it all right there, right?
That's right.
Yes. Yeah. So a few things. So the book is Wild City, and you can order it at the link that's in the chat, and you will be getting an email after this, which will give you the link to the recorded version of this, and also the link to buy the book. And then we at the Center for the Book are working with the Princeton Club to bring New York-centric type of authors to all of you. And in November, and I think I had it on a piece of paper, I think it's November 16th, we will be having singular sensation Michael Rydell, who is the theater critic for the New York Post. So what does he have to do these days? There's nothing happening. So he wrote a book about Broadway. So we will be having him in November. And so, wait, let me just, before we let you go there is, Oh, so this is a question to you. Did you ever read this great kids book called Travels with Marco about a pigeon that meets all these different nationalities for something good to eat? I don't know. I'm not familiar with that. But
I have not heard of that, but you know, I have become sort of radicalized as a pro pigeon advocate. So it's
you are
on the short list of books to read. I promise. No, it sounds great, and I hadn't heard of it, but I will definitely check it out.
Yes. Well, thank you, Tom, for,
Thank you,
oh,
Rocco.
wait, there were only 5 of 40 animals. There's still 35 more stories
Yes.
in the book. So,
Right.
as they said, you ain't heard nothing
You ain't
yet.
heard nothing yet. That's right, Rocco.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Yes. It was a lot of fun. And, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.